welcome everyone, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are around the world today. One of the benefits of this pandemic is that we've gotten the opportunity to kind of expand our network into regions of the world that we probably wouldn't have got to, as quickly as we have over the last 9 months. And one of those for me has been being able to meet Kate. And I came across her for kind of two reasons. One is she was out there on LinkedIn, one of the louder voices on LinkedIn, talking about data, but also talking about running in Spartan race, which I'm a bit of a fan of myself. But more on Kate in a few minutes. Thanks for joining us for the first session of 2021 for the business of data. This is a meetup that started over 3 years ago with Hamid and myself, my co-partner here, primarily with in-person events in Vancouver. And the reason we started was because we wanted to share use cases of what was happening in the data community, as well as help those who were, struggling to find their path in data. We all work with data, but not all of us have had the opportunity to dive into the depths, and the technology and the learnings and resources that are out there are at an all-time high. So sometimes it just takes a little bit of guidance, and this meetup was really put together to help folks navigate that and get to meet other people in the data space. So thank you for joining us. After sitting on the sidelines for the last 9 months, we finally decided to kick ourselves in the backside and put on some sessions virtually. And because of that, as I said, we're able to reach out to all the way to Queens, New York, to bring on Kate Strachnyi, who is a data expert. She's got 8.5 years of experience at Deloitte, 13 years total in finance as a data expert. Some of that in sales, I believe, as well. But if you're in finance, like marketing, those are two of the fields that have data. We're surrounded by data all the time, and always opportunities to work with data. Kate is now an entrepreneur. She's founded her own business called the DATAcated, Story by Data, which has also led to a conference called DATAcated Conference. And she held her first one-day conference back in October of 2020, had 7,000 attendees show up. And she's gone on now to organize her second DATAcated conference, which kicks off in February. So if you haven't signed up, we'll provide, you can go to Kate's Story by Data to register. And it's a 3-day event covering topics from uncovering value in data, which will be on the first day for 3 hours, trends in AI and ML, and then data storytelling on the last day. So she's brought together some really amazing speakers. She's put together some sponsors for it as well to make it all work. And for anyone who's ever been involved with putting on a conference before, it's a ton of effort. And I was telling Kate beforehand that she needs to give herself a pat on the back for what she's accomplished in such a short period of time. The first conference was really put on in 2 months, and that's very difficult to do. If you do that in a live event, there's a huge investment. There's a lot of things that have to kind of come together to put on a great event, and she was able to do that online in a very short period of time. And I have no doubt after attending her first conference back in October that this next one coming up on February 9th to 11th will be just as good, if not better. So I'll get to Kate in 1 second. As I mentioned, this is put on by myself and Hamid. Hamid is the founder of Integrity Co. Hamid, would you like to say a few words about Integrity Co?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom. I'm one of the founders of Integrity Co. It started by asking this question that what's wrong with consulting? And the problem that we found was that a lot of times our clients didn't really know what questions to answer or ask to start with, and then how to answer them to big after that. So what we focused about is helping them to ask the right questions and answer all of those questions using data in a way that they can rely on the answers and it's not subjective. So we're all about using data science, machine learning to ask questions that are impactful and answer them for our clients. We're located in Vancouver, but we have a big team all over the world.
Excellent. Thanks, Hamid. Now, the agenda for today, Kate's been kind enough to share some of her best practices from work in data visualization. And after that session, we will go into questions. I've got a series of questions to dive into, but if you've got any yourself that come up from the conversation that we're having, please jump in through the chat or the question part of it. Actually, the chat side of things, and Hamid will gather those up and throw those on to Kate as we're going through the discussion part. We should wrap up in about 45 minutes, so we can all get back to work and on our days. And if you're coming from Vancouver, you got blue sky, so I'm sure you probably want to be outside because that could disappear tomorrow. So Kate, welcome to the Business of Data.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me here, guys.
Excellent. Well, I already mentioned a bit of your bio, 8.5 years with Deloitte, 13 years in finance. Before you get into your data visualization presentation, what was the one thing that highlighted or told you that, hey, my career is going to be in data?
The career in data was actually sort of an accident. So I spent most of my time, like you mentioned, in finance and actually in risk management and regulatory compliance, helping banks get out of trouble, basically, out of, helping them face regulatory compliance and all the fun stuff that comes along with that. Obviously, data was a part of that, but not as directly as I'm working with things now. What happened was I was in consulting and working crazy hours, weekends, nights, traveling, been in Canada, all over actually. And I was having my first child, and I remember going to the company and asking for a role that can keep me working from home. So an internal role, non-client facing. And what they had available was an inside strategy manager, basically working with data. So about 6.5 years ago, that was my first time really having to build a data visualization. They gave me Tableau, they gave me a data set, and they said, okay, give me insights. And from that point on, I fell in love, and it's been a great relationship ever since with data.
Well, excellent. That's a great segue into your session on best practices in data visualization. So we'll let you take over and share your insights with the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my screen here. Here we go. All right. So the reason I actually started focusing in on visual best practices was going back to that role quickly. I remember putting things out in front of the manager at the time, obviously going from my first ever data visualization to about, a couple of weeks into it. He made a comment and he said, I don't know what you're doing, Kate, but it's looking better and better every time. And it's because I was putting in some research, doing some work, looking at really good data visualizations, trying to improve the work that I was putting together, mainly to try and keep that work from home job. But what actually ended up happening was I launched the whole course on visual best practices, and I'll walk through a few slides here that I actually cover in that course. And it basically starts with data visualization, right? What does it have to be? In order to be effective, data visualization has to be three things. Informative, which means it has to actually tell you something. Appealing. When a data visualization looks good, you tend to capture more attention from your audience, and that's exactly what they want. You want people to look at your data visualizations. And it has to be efficient. And what that means is you have to be able to communicate your data story in as little time as possible. So although those data viz art and those really cool looking charts are amazing and they're really attractive, a lot of times they're not as efficient as, let's say, a simple bar chart or a line graph that could really tell that data story. Now, I do have a data visualization process that I'll step through here. First is all about setting the context, right? So determining the audience and what is the question that you want to answer with data. Step two, here we go, we're getting the data. That's the exciting part. We're getting the data that's necessary to answer those questions. The important part here is only look at the data that's actually necessary for answering those questions. What tends to happen with data analysts, data scientists is we get this overwhelm of data and we don't know where to focus. So once you have the question ready, go ahead and answer that with data. Number three is method. So determining the most effective way to represent the information. This is really, and I'll get into this on the next slide, it's all about selecting the right chart or graph, if that's even needed, to actually represent the data and answer that data question. Part four is visualizing. So using visual best practices such as having a great title, using color effectively, proper labels, formatting, All of those things can take your data visualization from looking good to looking really great. And those were the differences that my manager was starting to see several years ago, where I would tweak the visualization just a little bit and he wouldn't even know what's happening. And last but not least, we are communicating this to stakeholders. So this is the storytelling part of the data visualization process where you're presenting your visualization. And I tend to add a little thing on the bottom there that says this is an iterative process and you kind of have to go back to step 4 sometimes, because chances are your audience will see this and say, hey, but can we add a drill down or a filter or change this or add something else? And that's when you go back to the visualization step and tweak your visualization and go back to communicating. Now here we have the DATAcated chart selector guide. So what does this do? It basically gives you a guide to start your visualization process. So once you know what kind of data question you have, what kind of data you're working with, there are some charts that do a better job at representing some types of data. So if we were to take an example and look at the single line chart, right over on the top left, you'll see next to there, or maybe you don't see, I'll read it out. It says it's used for displaying trends over a period of time for a single category. Okay, great. So if you're looking at, let's say, sales over time, you would probably be good with the single line chart. But then there are other types of data that could be represented. And this is just a starting point that really gets you some ideas in terms of what's possible. So you avoid just having bar charts or just having line charts. In some cases, you can get creative and use all these other chart types. I'm not going to get through all of this because I know we're not going to spend the entire session talking about best practices, but there are definitely some visual best practices that I recommend. And these are guidelines. These are not hard and fast rules because sometimes those rules are meant to be broken. But for the most part, if you kind of go through this checklist with your own data visualization, you'll be able to clean things up and take your visualization from good to great. So I'll walk through a couple of these now. Basically, the general part of the checklist just says, make sure the chart type is appropriate, which we just talked about, right? Select the right chart for the data. Objects working closely together to highlight a key finding or takeaway. By objects here, I mean, if you have a dashboard, making sure that all the charts are saying the same story, that you have proper annotations and titles, and all of those are working together to share one message. The next section is all about the layout, right? How many charts do you have in the view? How are you using that real estate? Are you putting data in logical order? You know, the most important things tend to go on the top left, depending on where you are regionally, but typically top left corner is saved for the most important part of your presentation. Ensuring that you're sizing things appropriately. One of my least favorite things to see in a data visualization is scroll bars or things that are scrunched up and you can't see the whole thing. It gets very frustrating, but we get over it. The next section is all about text. So text is actually very, very important here because it lets you tell the story in addition to the charts and graphs that you put out there. And the first time you probably will see the text is in the form of a title. So putting a title that's really descriptive is extremely helpful. My best practice is if you're putting together a slide deck or presentations, the title of your slide or your chart should actually tell your audience what the chart is telling them, right? So if sales are going up, your chart title could be sales have gone up since last quarter. This way, if they don't even look at the chart or they're confused by charts, they actually have the key takeaway right on top. And then let's go on over to format. So you can spend hours and hours in formatting land because there's so many little nuances that you can edit to make your visualization really pop and help tell that story. A couple of them are grid lines, right? Sometimes we have grid lines that are just too prominent. So turning those into a light gray or some kind of faded color is really helpful in showing the primary data points. Removing borders sometimes can help. Formatting data to a certain level of precision so you can round up to the thousands or the millions, depending on what you're working with. Definitely avoiding 3D or shape bevels because those really get confusing, and I could go on and on about why 3D charts are terrible, especially 3D pie charts, but maybe we'll save that for the end. Data legends, you know, they should be there if they're aiding for, you know, the audience actually tell what they're looking at, but they should be next to the chart that they're related to. a lot of these things I'm saying, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, duh, this is common sense. I know all this, but just like take the checklist and actually go through this with a data visualization and see how many things you can spot. Because though this is common sense, when we're visualizing, we tend to use software like Tableau, Power BI, and Click, and we use the default settings for all the formatting because we assume that the tool knows best. But taking the time to really be intentional with all of the stuff that we've covered so far can really help you tell a better data story. And then the last part in this checklist is all about color. So making sure that you're intentional in using color. Going back to the software tools, they tend to allow you to put, a rainbow color on a bar chart for no apparent reason, just because you can. And people do that because, hey, look, my visualization is pretty now. Avoid that at all costs, because unless you're talking about Skittles or you're literally visualizing the rainbow or something, because that gets confusing for your audience. The next section is about supporting data is muted or it's gray. So anything like a grid line or borders or axes, tick marks, making those kind of fade into the background but still there to be helpful is really important. Not more than 5 colors are used in the visualization. Again, rules are meant to be broken sometimes, but I feel like if you're using more than 5 colors, maybe you should ask yourself, are you really telling just one data story? Because a lot of times you can remove some parts of the data to actually tell your story, which will result in using less color and telling a much more clear story. All right, so I'm going to go into an example. This is the last part, Tom. This is an example of what not to do, okay? So if you're looking at this right now, you're just tuning in, don't do this. This is an example of a data visualization that literally hurt me to put together. I felt pain because I broke every one of the rules that I possibly could break. So let's go through some of the things that are bad here, right? First off, the title is very small on top, price changes and consumer goods and services. Okay, doesn't really give us much information. It's really small. The subtitle is too big. We're going crazy with the colors here. This is the rainbow effect that I've told you to avoid. We have that not great looking scroll bar, which really there's no excuse to have a scroll bar. I think we have like 13 or 15 categories here. We could probably size it appropriately to avoid those scroll bars. And we're not really sure what we're even looking at based on this chart. I know because I built it. This is all about the price changes of consumer products and services over a period of 20 years, but that's just not clear here. Also, our grid lines are too prominent. We have the numbers on there plus an axis, and the axis is bright green with underlines. So it's a complete mess. And now I'm going to go ahead and show you that once you apply visual best practices, you can transform the visualization into something more like this. Now, we still have a title, we have a subtitle that provides us more information, and you can actually just read the sentence that says consumer products and services categories that increased in price by over 50%. And when you read that, you'll notice that that part is in orange, and you'll know that the bars that are orange correlate with the increase in price by over 50%. So this is a way to use color intentionally. And you can actually save space because we don't even need a color legend because we place that into our subtitle. And I actually love using this example, not for the visualization side of things, but also the message that look at the kinds of things that that have gone up in price in the USA in the past 20 years. College tuition, education, childcare. I mean, if you keep going further, medical care, and things that have gone down in price, TVs, software, toys. I truly wish it was the opposite, so we can have more affordable college tuition, childcare, and medical care. But I felt like this is a powerful story to share, and I'm pretty sure. Yep, that was the end of the presentation. Hopefully that helps you on your data visualization journey.
Well, thank you, Kate. I appreciate those insights. On one of your slides, you talked about the process, and the last point was communication. And in data storytelling and data visualization, that point often gets lost. It's the same about any type. Whenever there's a growth in any type of medium, whether it's newsletters back in the day when they were just on a printed sheet, from the rise of the Macs that, you can start doing publishing. Everyone can publish. I always came across as saying, just because you can't doesn't mean you should. And it's all about communication. I guess we could also say the same about data visualization today.
Yes, absolutely. Just because you can does not mean you should. And this is something that I feel like the data visualization tools have made it really, really easy for us to do. We literally have to double click or drag and drop a couple of fields and boom, we have charts, we have graphs, we have a dashboard in minutes, right? Can build a 60-page dashboard in a couple of minutes just by clicking around. And that ease of use is actually hindering us because we create visualizations for the sake of creating them because we can. I remember some corporations that we worked with, they would have tons and tons of dashboards. Some were used, some were not used, some were not updated even though they were used. And it's called dashboard crawl, right? You're just crawling in dashboards because they were so easy to develop, but without the really intentional thought process of why we're going to create this, where is this going, who's using this, you can actually end up in a worse place than you were before.
Excellent. You mentioned 3D charts. Any other pet peeves when it comes to choosing the right chart? One for me is pie charts. I often see visualizations with 10 or more items in a pie chart, which past 3 or 4, you're not able to read anything else.
Yes. I mean, there are some things you can do with pie charts, and I'm also anti-pie chart, just for the record. But some clients want it, right? Because they're like, oh, but pie charts, they look cool. So some want a donut chart, which is essentially the same thing, a pie with a hole in the middle. And you mentioned having 10 or more categories. One way you can actually work around that if you really were kind of cornered into creating a pie chart is, let's say you wanted to focus in on one specific category out of the 15. And here's where the use of color can really help you out, because if you just color that one category, let's say bright blue, and keep the rest a shade of gray, it can really help you tell that story without people being confused. Otherwise, if everything is a rainbow color, you look at it, you get confused, you're hypnotized by the pie chart, and you don't know what you're looking at.
Now, outside of 3D charts, pie charts, what other common mistakes do you see people make when it comes to data visualization?
Yeah, aside from the charts, I think the clutter, right? Because what happens is when we use the default settings with some of the data visualization software, we have things in the chart that don't necessarily need to be in the chart, or we don't take the time to filter or drill down to the specific questions that we're trying to answer. So that clutter is that whole formatting piece that I was talking about, making sure that if you're talking about dollars, add the dollar, add the currency, right? So people are not confused if they're looking at dollars or maybe another currency, or is this centimeters or inches, you have to add that clarity, because just because you know something doesn't mean your audience knows, right? And this is, the curse of knowledge. It's very difficult for people who know something really well to tell that story to somebody who doesn't know it. Because you're standing there like, how do you not understand? I spent 8 months with this data. How do you not know what I'm talking about? So that's another one.
Do you have any favorite books that you could recommend to our audience today that help you along the way, or just ones that you've seen in the last couple of years?
Yes, absolutely. My favorite book is Storytelling with Data by Cole Knaflic. That was the first book I actually purchased when I was starting out in data visualization. And she goes over all of the visual best practices, and she has really great examples, and she has her own process that she takes people through. So I highly recommend that book.
We've, in the last 5 years, there's been an explosion in new technology, probably the last 6 years. We've gone from a world where, data has been controlled by gatekeepers to a large extent to where now it's really accessible to a much wider audience. Not everybody, but if you've got a little bit of knowledge and a bit of confidence, you can dive in and explore, everything from a small data set to large data sets that are provided by Google to everybody, or out there to the community, to your own city's data that's available. What do you think, what have you seen has been kind of the driver in the last 5 years that have helped to democratize data?
Yeah, I think going back to the software that I mentioned, it's made it so easy for people to visualize data. And I think that's really helped to democratize data because it gives you access without the, I guess, the obstacle of having to learn how to code or the obstacle of having to learn these complicated systems. I mean, I literally taught Tableau to my nephew when he was, I think he was 10 years old. I showed it to him and in minutes, he was creating calculated fields and creating charts and graphs, and it was that easy. And I think it's that ease that makes it easier for us to democratize data. Although I did mention some of the downsides, right? Because it's that easy, my 10-year-old nephew doesn't know what he's really doing in there. It might look cool. He doesn't know what's happening underneath, right? So I think we still need, we're still pretty far from being data literate as a, as a people. It's making it easier for us to visualize and tell data stories, but I think we still need to work on learning how the data is structured and what we are actually sharing.
You've mentioned Tableau a few times. You put together a fairly large document that outlines the top 20 kind of reporting tools that is available. If you go to Story by Data, you can request that document from Kate and it'll be delivered right away. But outside of Tableau and Power BI, what are the common tools that you use today, that are, obviously accessible to you? And what are the tools you wish you could be using if you had the right use case for it?
Right. I'd say Data Wrapper. It's one of these tools that's not talked about enough. It's a free tool that you can go ahead and use. I think it's based in Germany. But yeah, if you go to Data Wrapper, that's one of them. And the reason is because once you build a visualization, I don't think they have as many capabilities as Tableau or Power BI. But if you needed something quick and free that you can build on your own, it's really good because it doesn't really give you something that looks bad. So whatever kind of data you feed into it, it's going to give you a visualization that looks really good based on that visual best practices checklist that I talked about. So they follow those rules from the get-go. And then I'll have to mention one more, which is Flourish. It's Flourish Studio, and they're really awesome at creating animated charts. So if you've ever seen those like racing bar charts or the Sankey charts that are animated and flow from one side to the other, Flourish is probably where those charts were developed. Again, free to use and really, really awesome stuff.
Excellent. I haven't heard of those two, so I'll have to do some exploring. I'll just add one that I really like, and we're hoping to have one of the founders on in a couple of weeks, is a company called Count out of the UK. Count.co is the domain name. And for those of us who know a little bit of SQL, but not enough to really dive into the data, or just enough to be dangerous, this tool is excellent because you can do drag and drop and it builds the SQL for you. So for those SQL experts, you can still put that in to your heart's delight. But for those like myself who just have enough knowledge to do some cursory analysis, you can actually get a lot deeper than you could otherwise without having to learn SQL. So it's another one that I really like. But when it comes to BI tools, sorry, Hamid, you had a question?
Yes, actually, that's one of the questions asked in the chat as well. Do you have any favorite tools to detect outliers or any low quality data points in your data before visualizing? Because we know that it's good to have high quality data that we use for our dashboards.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great point. So back over in my role at Deloitte, I actually had a team of data scientists that would clean and prep the data. So personally, I never had to deal with it, but I was working with some data quality professionals before, and I know the pain that people have to go through to get data into the shape that they need. But even for my own data, let's say for the prior conference, I would look at some of the data of people's titles and company names. And the easiest way for me to kind of clean all that data up and classify it properly was actually in Tableau. But you can use any visualization tool. You can even use Excel to pull something off like this, depending on the size of your data. I didn't have that many data points. But visualizing something can actually help you spot some of those outliers and poor data quality points, because just throwing things on a scatter plot or a bar chart, you'll see if something is just really crazy, like a really crazy big bar, a really crazy small one, something that doesn't belong. You can go in there and drill down and kind of look at the underlying data and try to figure that out and then go and clean that up.
Excellent. So when it comes to selling data, it sounds like you had a pretty good manager at Deloitte who was encouraging you to, improve the process and the visualizations that you're working with. But not all of us are fortunate to have bosses and managers and CEOs who understand data or understand the value of data. So what strategies do you have to gain buy-in from management for those who are, can see the value in the data, know there's insight, but haven't quite been able to take that next step, which is getting, additional investment from the management team?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I definitely had experience with that. So a lot of times people would say, hey, I've always done things without data. Why do I need it now? Right? It's always worked this way. I don't see why we need it. So I think it's always good to demonstrate sometimes the cost savings that come along with, let's say, visualizing data. I'll give an example here. We had a PowerPoint document that we would build, and I believe it was 80 pages, 80 slides or so. And each page was it was the same format, right? But it had different data points on it. So if you picture like 8 different categories, and they would change every time you flip a slide. What you could do is you could replace that with one dashboard, right? It's really easy to do. And then all people have to do is filter on one of those 84 things, select their name or something, and then it creates a visual. So the way that I kind of sold that idea was I didn't even ask if they needed it. I just saw the need and I built it on my free time because I love data visualization and I would literally stick it wherever I can. That's how much I loved it. I still love it. And when I showed this to them, one, they were impressed because now they don't have to update 84 slides. They have to update an underlying spreadsheet, which is a lot more standardized and easier to manage. And two, you can actually now see who's actually gone on to see this dashboard. You have tracking abilities. So selling them on some of the added benefits is really helpful if that's something that you can use in your use case.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that. Now, we've talked a little bit about visualization. Let's talk a bit about diving off a cliff at the start of a pandemic and starting DATAcated, and really going out as a full-time consultant, because most normal people don't do that right before a pandemic starts or during a pandemic. So I imagine that was planned a little bit in advance. But what was the major driver for you to kind of take that leap to take your faith into your own hands and start your own business at a full-time basis?
Yeah, so first of all, I didn't know it was going to be a global pandemic, Tom. Okay, when I had this idea, there was something in one country, and it was focused there, and I'm like, okay, well, that's probably going to die out in like a week, right? I think it'll just pass, just like the murder hornets and the other stuff that go huge on the news, and then a week later they come up with something else to talk about. So if I could go back, I probably would do it again because it actually turned out really well for myself. But I don't know if I would have the courage to do it knowing that there was a pandemic. So I'm actually glad that I didn't know that that's happening. But to answer your question, I always knew that I wanted to be a business owner. Even when I came to America when I was almost 9 years old, I started a business before I knew how to speak English. So I actually sold bookmarks, nothing to do with data visualization, but I would sell bookmarks that had little braided things out of yarn and people can use them. And the kids bought them. I would draw Pikachu stuff on there. And I remember the teacher telling me, oh, wow, you're so nice. I'm like, yeah, do you want one to take $1.50? And then I got in trouble because apparently you can't sell things in an elementary school. You can't run your business. But that was kind of the start of my entrepreneurial thinking. I always wanted to go off on my own. And I was always waiting for the right time. So I figured in March of last year, it's never going to be the right time, but I knew one thing, and that thing was I had a pretty good data community on LinkedIn, and the work I wanted to do was all around data and working with that community. So I decided to just take the chance because we really do just live once, and every year that I don't do something is a year lost. So really happy with my decision and definitely wouldn't want to go back.
Well, I really love your tagline, DATAcated. Was that something that just came to you through osmosis, or was it something you were working on for a while?
I wish I could remember. I don't know where the word came from. I know I tried to make it a play of words as being dedicated to data. For the longest time, my LinkedIn tagline was obsessed with data science. That's when I was just getting into it. And I truly was obsessed. That's all I would talk about. And then I decided to change that to dedicated. And then I'm like, wait, DATAcated. And it has the sound of my name in there. So it just worked beautifully. I ended up getting it trademarked. That took a whole year. Very fun process with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. But finally I own it and I can have it on my shirt without getting in trouble and all that.
That's awesome. I think Hamid has a question from the audience.
Another technical question. It's more about what do you do? What processes do you have before visualization? For example, data cleaning was part of it, biases in your data and such. Before doing analysis on your data or visualizing your data, what processes do you have? And even how do you form questions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, it was actually forming questions based on what the department was thinking. So the questions never really came from me. They really came from my target audience, which was the management team. And the questions would be kind of, what's driving sales and how's our pipeline looking? Knowing those data questions, I was able to identify the data points I needed. And that was not as easy as just saying, hey, I need sales numbers. No, especially if you're working in a really large corporation, you need special access rights. You need to work with probably 5 or maybe 8 different systems that have to work together and consolidate that data. Hamid, you're really bringing me back to those data cleaning days. It's not easy to get data from, let's say 5 different systems and have them all talk together in one dashboard. That was probably one of the hardest things I ever had to do, was make sure that that data talks to itself and is in line and is actually showing you the valid data points. So it all happens with, building something, putting it all together, but then also going back to the original data sources and fact checking, making sure that what you're showing your audience before you show it to them is actually facts. A lot of times the systems were either outdated, and we faced all sorts of data quality issues from people not filling in the right fields in, let's say, Salesforce or somewhere else. But this is just all part of that data analytics job, where you have to really clean everything and understand the data from A to Z before you can visualize. Visualization is the fun part.
Do you have a process to, for example, avoid confirmation bias or any type of bias that is in your data but should not be there really, or would affect your answers or questions you ask?
Yes, I think going into it, I know we're meant to have a hypothesis when we're trying to answer data questions, but sometimes going into it without a hypothesis. And what I mean by that is, at some point I was dealing with a large sum of survey data, and the team had a hypothesis of what they were hoping to get back from gathering the survey information. And what I came back with to them was not what they expected to see, right? And they basically said, hey, like, can you go back and maybe recheck? And I'm like, yeah, I can go back and recheck, but the answers are going to be the same. So I think sometimes going into things without thinking about what you want the answer to be, and just going into it, maybe giving it to somebody who doesn't have as many opinions about the data itself and letting them analyze it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Excellent. Now, you're a walking, talking resource, but you've also got courses available for those who want to learn more about data visualization, including visual best practices, data to dashboards for both Power BI and Tableau. And then your new one that's coming out in 10 days, DATAcated storytelling, or 8 days, I should say, that includes the best practices. You want to share a bit more about those courses and how people can sign up for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So to sign up, it's basically DATAcatedacademy.com. And that's where you can learn more about the courses and see the curriculum and the outline of what's covered. But I'll start with the data to dashboard courses. Those are fun. So it's basically taking you from never having used Tableau or Power BI, giving you a data set and teaching you how to build your own dashboard. And those courses are fun. I'm actually building them because I was really passionate about exploring all the data visualization tools that are available. So if you think back to the tools guide that you mentioned earlier, Tom, the plan is actually to create 20 of those data to dashboard courses. So with Click and Sisense, Excel, Python, R, using that same data and going to that same dashboard across all those different tools. So that's the data to dashboard series. The visual best practices course basically covers 3 things. One is selecting the right chart. The other one is reducing clutter, and proper use of color. And that's where we do a deep dive on each of those charts that I showed you in that chart selector guide. We go through all the best practices. When do we use this chart? What do we do when we're using this chart, and how do we use it properly? And then the most recent that's coming out in 8 days that I'm working on nonstop is the DATAcated storytelling course, which is actually going to absorb the visual best practices course into itself. I feel like it should be part of a broader storytelling course. And in this, we're actually covering how do you determine what story to tell? How do you actually present the story? How do you apply those visual best practices? How do you get feedback and all the psychological, emotional aspects of storytelling? So that's going to be hopefully the best course in the academy, and having so much fun building all of that.
And before we get to a few other questions from the audience, of course, you have the conference coming up in a few weeks' time. 3 days, as I mentioned earlier. What is it, 12 speakers per day over the first 3 hours, running from 9 a.m. to noon?
So yes, we're gonna have, it's slightly different this time. So we're still having the 10-minute lightning talks, but what I'm switching things up from the last conference to this conference is I'm allowing about 8 minutes of Q&A with the live audience this time with each of the speakers. So each speaker technically gets 20 minutes, 10 minutes for the presentation, and the rest to engage with the audience. Because for the first conference in October, we had over 5,300 comments come in, and I probably read only about 40 or 50 in that time frame. So I want to make sure I engage the audience a lot more this time.
Great. Why don't we take another question from the audience, Hamid, before we wrap things up?
Absolutely. So the last question, let's see, well, we have tons of different questions, still talking about the quality of data, how to make sure that the data has high quality. Maybe this is a different question. How about using tables in presentations? Any tips on whether to use tables at all in the presentation? If so, what type of tables, how big, what type of information?
Yes, thanks for that question. So I remember very clearly one of my clients that I did some consulting for. They were a finance company, and they gave me some data. They wanted to see how their performance is doing across different funds. And I put together what I thought were some really great charts that told the story of how their funds are performing. The first thing he says is, where's the table? Like, what do you mean, where's the table? We're visualizing data. You wanted charts. This is why you hired me. Well, basically, finance people think differently. They like to see the tables. They like to see the numbers. So what we ended up doing was creating the charts, and underneath each chart, we would have the raw data, because the chart can help you spot any trends and outliers, find out what the story is. But then they wanted to drill down, and this was a paper presentation, so you can't just hover over it or click on it. And having that table was really handy for them. So that's just one of the use cases. But in some areas, people literally just want the table, and that's one type of data visualization that you can create.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Tino, I know you're there. You've got an interesting question. I'm going to connect you with Kate later to maybe get some clarification on that question. We're going to wrap things up, unfortunately, today at this point. But Kate, thank you once again for joining us. It's been a pleasure to get to know you a little bit and have you join us here at the Business of Data. And I'm looking forward to your conference coming up in a few weeks. And for those, you can go to Story by Data, and there's a link there to sign up. And yeah, thank you once again. It's been a blast to have you aboard.
And before everyone going, we have an event coming up on 24th of February. Lloyd, one of the founders of Both AI, who just raised $23 million, is gonna tell us about how they use data science and data for their operation, to optimize their operation, making sure that everything is scientific and everything is objective rather than subjective. So join us. It's gonna be on February 24th at 10 a.m. We might have a session in between, again, on data science as well. We're gonna let you know. If you are on our mailing list, all good. If not, please send me your email. I will make sure that you get the info.
Excellent. Well, Kate, thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day and week in New York. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. We look forward to hosting some other events, as Hamid mentioned, in the near future with everyone. So thanks once again.
Thank you,
everyone.